My husband texted me, "I just inherited the family fortune of $3 million. Pack your things and get out by Friday." The divorce folder was already on the table. I signed it. Good luck. But you forgot that. Good day, dear listeners. It's Louisa again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Martha Collins, and I am 68 years old. For 41 years, I was a wife. Not a perfect wife, no such thing exists, but a present one. I cooked, I raised our 2 children, I worked part-time at the public library for 22 years. I drove Ronald to his cardiology appointments when his knees got too bad for him to drive himself. And I sat beside him in the dark during the 3 nights after his mother's funeral, when he didn't say a word, but needed someone to breathe next to him. That was my marriage. That was my life. I had built it the way you build a house you intend to die in. Carefully, without rushing, with attention to the foundations. We lived in Clover Creek, a small town in Western Virginia where everybody knows your last name and your grandmother's maiden name. Our house was a 2-story colonial on Birchwood Lane with a rose garden I had planted the first spring we moved in. The roses were still blooming every June. I had always taken that as a sign of something good. Ronald, Ron, I always called him Ron, had retired 6 years earlier from his position as a county land assessor. He was a tall man with a gray mustache and a habit of checking his watch, even when he didn't need to know the time. He was not a warm man, but I had learned to read him the way you learn to read weather. A certain silence meant irritation. A particular tone meant he wanted to be agreed with. I had spent 4 decades becoming fluent in that language, and I had stopped questioning whether fluency was the same as happiness. The changes started small. That is how it always begins, isn't it? Small enough that you tell yourself you're imagining it. Last spring, about 8 months before the morning everything broke open, Ron started spending more time on his phone. This was unusual. He had always been suspicious of technology, the kind of man who still wrote checks at the grocery store and called streaming services that internet nonsense. But suddenly, he was typing, scrolling, stepping into the garage to take calls. When I asked him once, mildly, who he was talking to, he said, "Deb. She's having car trouble." Deb was his niece, Deborah Howell, his sister's youngest daughter. She was 43, twice divorced, and had always made me feel faintly invisible, the way certain people can, without ever saying anything directly rude. I didn't think much of it then. I should have. The next sign came in July, when Ron's older sister Pauline passed away in her home in Roanoke. Pauline had never married, never had children, and had spent 30 years working as an accountant for a construction firm. She had been, by all accounts, careful with money. Ron flew out to handle the estate arrangements. He was gone for 4 days. When he came back, he was quieter than usual, not grieving, quiet. I knew that silence. I had heard it after his mother died. This was different. This was the quiet of someone thinking hard about something they weren't sharing. I noticed he made 2 phone calls that week behind the closed door of his study. I noticed he drove to the county courthouse one Tuesday morning and told me only that he was running errands. I noticed he looked at me sometimes across the dinner table with an expression I couldn't read. And after 41 years, there were very few of his expressions I couldn't read. I told myself I was being paranoid. I was a 68-year-old woman who had perhaps read too many mystery novels at the library. I told myself that grief makes people strange and private. I was still telling myself that on the morning of September the 4th, I had been out in the garden, deadheading the last of the summer roses. It was a cool morning, the kind that smells like the end of something. I came inside through the back door, washed my hands at the kitchen sink, and saw my phone on the counter. There was a text message from Ron. Ron was upstairs in the house, and he had sent me a text message instead of walking 20 steps to speak to me. I dried my hands. I picked up the phone. I read it. Martha, I just inherited Pauline's estate, close to $3 million. This changes things. I need you to pack your things and be out of the house by Friday. Don't make this difficult. I stood at that kitchen sink for a long moment. The faucet was still dripping. Outside, a blue jay landed on the rose arbor and then flew away. I walked into the living room. There on the coffee table, next to the ceramic bowl where we kept spare keys, was a manila folder. On its tab, in Ron's handwriting, divorce. Collins. I opened it. The papers had already been prepared. His signature was already on the last page. I picked up my phone. I typed back, "Good luck, Ron, but you forgot something." Then I set the phone face down on the table, sat in my armchair, and began to think. I want to be honest about what happened inside me in the first hour after I read that message, because I think people expect a woman my age, a grandmother, a gardener, a retired library clerk, to either collapse or immediately transform into some kind of warrior. Neither happened. What happened was quieter and more complicated than either of those things. I sat in my armchair for a long time. The house was completely still. I could hear Ron moving around upstairs. The creak of the floorboards in the master bedroom, the distant sound of a drawer opening and closing. He was up there waiting, I realized. Waiting for what? For crying? For shouting? For me to come up the stairs and beg? The fear came first. I won't pretend otherwise. It moved through me the way cold water moves through a body, from the chest outward, into the hands, into the feet. I was 68 years old. My retirement savings were modest. The house on Birchwood Lane was the primary asset we shared. I had not worked full-time in over a decade. I had 2 adult children. My daughter Karen, who lived in Charlotte with her own family, and my son David, who was navigating his own difficult divorce in Portland. I was not a woman with a fortress of independent resources. I was a woman who had invested 41 years into something that was being handed back to me in a manila folder. That was the fear. It was real, and I let myself feel it fully, because I have learned that ignoring fear doesn't make it smaller. It only makes it sneakier. But underneath the fear, something else was forming. Something slower and more solid. I got up from the chair and went to the kitchen. I made myself a cup of tea. Not because I particularly wanted tea, but because I needed something to do with my hands while my mind worked. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Ron and I had eaten breakfast together for 36 years, and I began, methodically, to think. What did I actually know? I knew that Pauline had died and left what Ron described as approximately $3 million. I knew that Ron had driven to the courthouse. I knew that the divorce papers were already prepared, which meant he had hired an attorney before he told me anything, which meant this had been planned, not impulsive, planned. And then, sitting at that kitchen table with my tea going cold, I remembered something. Something I had heard years ago at a neighborhood gathering from a woman named Shirley Baxter, whose husband had also received an inheritance late in life. Shirley had mentioned, almost in passing, that in the state of Virginia, assets acquired during a marriage could, in certain circumstances, be considered marital property. Even inheritances, depending on how they were handled after receipt. I am not a lawyer. I want to be clear about that. But I am a woman who spent 22 years organizing information for other people, and I know the difference between a rumor and a lead worth pursuing. I also remembered something more specific, something Ron had said when he came back from Roanoke. He had mentioned, just once and briefly, that Pauline's will had been complicated, that there had been some question about the property. He hadn't elaborated, and I hadn't pushed. But now I was pushing, inside my own head, as hard as I could. What question? About what property? And then, like a key turning in a lock I hadn't known was there, I remembered something else entirely. Pauline's house in Roanoke. Ron had mentioned years ago that my mother-in-law had gifted Pauline that house in the 1980s. But my mother-in-law had purchased that property using proceeds from the sale of a small farm. And that farm had originally been, I pressed my memory hard, partially in both her name and her late husband's name, which meant there might be questions about how clean the title was, which might mean there were other parties with potential interests. I was speculating. I knew I was speculating, but speculation, directed carefully, is where plans begin. I finished my tea. I rinsed the cup. I walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room where I kept my personal papers. Separate from Ron's files, always had been. A small, private habit I'd maintained since the children were young. I found the notepad I used for grocery lists, and I turned to a clean page. At the top, I wrote one word, attorney. Below it, I wrote, marital property, Virginia law. Inheritance rules. Property acquired during marriage. Below that, Pauline's estate. What exactly was left? What was the question Ron mentioned? And below that, underlined twice. When exactly did Ron hire a divorce attorney, and how long has this been in motion? Because that last question mattered enormously. If Ron had begun planning this divorce before Pauline died, that was one set of facts. If he had begun planning it after, if he had seen that money coming and immediately started maneuvering, that was a different set of facts entirely, and different facts produce different legal realities. I heard Ron coming down the stairs. I closed the notepad, slid it into my cardigan pocket, and turned to face him. He stood in the doorway of the living room. He was dressed, keys in hand. He looked at me with the expression I had seen across the dinner table, that unreadable look. And I understood now what it was. It was not grief. It was not guilt. It was calculation. I'm going out, he said. All right, I said. He waited, as if expecting something more. I gave him nothing. After he left, I sat back down and added one more item to my list. Do not let him see what I'm thinking. I had 41 years of practice at that. It turned out that was going to be useful. The next morning, I waited until Ron left the house. He had taken to leaving early, another new habit. And by 8:15, his truck was out of the driveway. I watched it go from the kitchen window. Then I went upstairs, dressed carefully in the navy blazer I wore to church and to appointments that mattered, and I drove myself into town. Clover Creek is small, which presented a specific problem. There were two attorneys in town, Frank Dietrich, who had handled our neighbor's estate and played golf with Ron every other Saturday, and a younger woman named Patricia Gale, who had opened a practice on Mill Street about 3 years ago, specializing in family law. I had seen her name on a small sign, neat black letters on a cream background, every time I drove past on my way to the library. I parked in front of Patricia Gale's office and went inside. She was younger than I'd expected. Early 40s, dark hair pulled back, reading glasses pushed up on her head. Her office smelled like coffee and new carpet. She looked up when I came in and said simply, "Good morning. How can I help you?" I sat down across from her desk and I told her everything. Not with tears, I was past the tears, or at least past the visible ones, but clearly and in order. The text message, the manila folder, The divorce papers already signed, the inheritance from Pauline, the courthouse visit, the phone calls, the comment about some question regarding the estate, my own recollection about Virginia property law. Patricia Gale listened without interrupting. She took 3 pages of notes. When I finished, she set down her pen and said, "Mrs. Collins, I want to ask you something directly." "Please do," I said. "Do you want to fight this divorce, or do you want to fight for what's fair inside it?" It was exactly the right question. And I had been thinking about the answer since the moment I sat down in my armchair the previous morning. "I don't want to preserve the marriage," I said. "That ship has sailed. I want what I'm owed, legally and completely." She nodded slowly. "Then here's what I need you to understand first. In Virginia, an inheritance is generally considered separate property, belonging to the spouse who received it. But there are exceptions. If the inherited funds are commingled with marital assets, deposited into a joint account, used to pay joint expenses, invested jointly, they can become marital property. Has your husband deposited any of this money into an account you share?" "I don't know yet," I said. "That's the first thing we find out." She paused. "The second thing, you mentioned he visited the county courthouse before he told you about the inheritance or the divorce. That timing is important. If he took any legal steps to protect that inheritance, formed a separate account, transferred any property, before disclosing it to you, that becomes part of the picture." She looked at me steadily. "And, Mrs. Collins, the fact that the divorce papers were already prepared when you received that text suggests he had retained counsel well in advance. We can potentially find out when those papers were first drafted." I felt something settle in my chest. The fear was still there, but it had been given a container. It had been given a shape. I retained Patricia Gale that morning, wrote the retainer check from my personal account, the small savings account I had kept in my name only since the late 90s, one of the few financial decisions that had been entirely mine, and drove home feeling like a woman who has found her footing on uncertain ground. What I did not expect was how quickly Ron noticed. I found out later, much later, exactly how it happened. He had run into Frank Dietrich at the gas station that afternoon. Frank had mentioned, conversationally, that he'd seen my car parked outside Patricia Gale's office. Ron came home that evening in a different kind of silence than I had seen before. Not calculating, tighter, sharper. "Did you go somewhere today?" he asked at dinner. "I ran some errands," I said. The same words he had used when he went to the courthouse. Something moved across his face. He didn't ask again. That same evening, my phone rang. It was Deborah. She opened pleasantly, asking how I was, making small talk about the weather. And I let her. I sat in my armchair and listened and said very little, but what she was doing underneath the pleasantness became clear within about 4 minutes. She was fishing. She wanted to know if I had spoken to anyone. She wanted to know what I was planning. She mentioned, almost casually, that Ron was under so much stress and that she hoped things could be handled quietly and simply, and that she knew I was a reasonable woman. Reasonable? The way she said it, it meant compliant. "I'm sure everything will work out as it should," I told her, and said goodnight. The next morning, Patricia called me. Her voice was careful and precise. "Martha," she said, "I've done some preliminary research on the Pauline Howell estate. I found the probate filing. And Pauline's will named Ronald as sole beneficiary of her estate. That includes the Roanoke property and her financial accounts, which totaled approximately $2.8 million at time of death." A brief pause. "But here is what's interesting. The probate record also shows a codicil, an amendment to the will, that was filed 6 weeks before Pauline died." My hand tightened on the phone. "What does the codicil say?" It excludes one item from Ronald's inheritance: a savings account at First Regional Bank of Roanoke, held in Pauline's name with a designated beneficiary. Another pause. Martha, you are the designated beneficiary of that account. The room went very quiet. How much? I asked. $240,000, Patricia said. Pauline left it to you directly, not to Ronald, to you. I sat with that for a moment. Pauline, whom I had driven to her eye appointments when her license was suspended in her final years. Pauline, for whom I had sent birthday cards every year without fail, and Christmas cookies, and a handwritten note after her hip surgery. Pauline, who had watched her brother's marriage for 41 years and apparently understood something about it that I was only now beginning to understand myself. He knew, I said quietly, not a question. Almost certainly, Patricia said, which means he had reason, financial reason, to move quickly. That was the moment everything became clear. Not just that he had been planning to leave me, but that he had been planning to leave me before I found out that Pauline had left me something he couldn't touch. I was not just being discarded, I was being outmaneuvered, and he had nearly succeeded. Patricia moved quickly after that call. Within 48 hours, she had filed a formal notice of contested divorce proceedings and submitted a request for full financial disclosure. Every account, every asset, every transaction Ron had made in the past 18 months. That last part was the one with teeth. In Virginia, a spouse in contested divorce proceedings is legally required to disclose all financial activity, which meant Ron would have to account for every move he had made since Pauline's death. At the same time, Patricia contacted First Regional Bank of Roanoke and initiated the process to claim the account Pauline had left me. The money was mine by direct designation. It didn't pass through the estate. It didn't require Ron's involvement, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. In approximately 3 weeks, $240,000 would be transferred into an account in my name. I hadn't told Ron any of this. I went about my days as normally as I could. I watered the garden. I cooked dinner, though we ate it in a silence that had changed in quality. Less cold, more brittle, like the surface of ice that sounds hollow when you tap it. Ron was on his phone constantly. I noticed he had moved his laptop to his study and started closing the door. On the third morning after Patricia filed, I was in the kitchen making breakfast when Ron came downstairs earlier than usual. He was dressed, and his expression was the one I now recognized, that tight, sharp silence. He sat down across from me at the table. He didn't take any of the eggs I had made. I know you hired Patricia Gale, he said. I know you know, I said, and put a cup of coffee in front of him out of habit. Martha. His voice was different now, lower. I had heard it before. Not often, but a few times over the years, when something or someone had pushed against what he felt was his. This is going to get expensive and ugly for both of us. The smart thing to do is accept the terms I've offered and move on. What terms? I asked genuinely. You sent me a text message telling me to pack my bags. I don't recall any terms. His jaw tightened. You'd get the car, some savings, a reasonable settlement. Patricia will review any formal offer, I said. He stared at me for a long moment. You don't want to do this the hard way, he said. I'm not doing it any particular way, I said. I'm simply following the legal process. He pushed back from the table and left. That afternoon, Deborah called again. This time there was no pleasantness at all. She told me, and I am going to try to reproduce this accurately because the words matter, that I was making a very serious mistake, that Ron had been patient and fair with me, that contesting the divorce would only hurt my children, and that if I continued making trouble, She would make sure that everyone in Clover Creek knew I had lost my mind in my old age. She used that phrase specifically, lost my mind in my old age. I let her finish. Then I said, Deborah, any further communication regarding legal matters should go through my attorney. Good afternoon. I hung up. My hands were steady. I was surprised by that. But what happened 2 days later was less easy to remain steady through. I came home from a short grocery run to find Ron's truck in the driveway and Deborah's silver sedan parked behind it. When I came through the front door, they were both in the living room. Deborah was standing by the bookcase. Ron was by the window. They had clearly been waiting. We need to talk, Deborah said. You're in my home without an invitation, I said. Ron still lives here, she said, which was technically true. I set down my grocery bags in the hallway and stood in the doorway of my own living room, where I had lived for 36 years, and I looked at them both. Deborah was thinner than I remembered, with that sharp, watchful look she always had, like someone perpetually assessing what they might be able to take. Ron stood with his arms crossed, not quite meeting my eyes. What followed was approximately 20 minutes of pressure that I can only describe as a coordinated effort. Deborah did most of the talking. She laid out very explicitly what they believed would happen if I continued the contested proceedings. A long, expensive legal battle that would drain whatever small savings I had. A process that would, as she put it, air family business all over Clover Creek. Possible countersuits regarding the retainer account I had used to pay Patricia. And finally, and this was delivered quietly, which somehow made it worse, the suggestion that Ron might choose to move back into the house with Deborah's assistance and simply wait me out. I stood in the doorway throughout all of this. I didn't sit down. I noticed, at some point, that I had stopped feeling afraid and had started feeling something else. Something colder and more focused. When Deborah finished, I said, I'd like you both to leave now. Martha, Ron started. I'd like you to leave, I repeated. If you'd like to discuss settlement terms, you can have your attorney contact Patricia Gale. That is what attorneys are for. There was a long, ugly moment. Deborah looked at me with an expression that I think was supposed to be contemptuous, but landed closer to frustrated. Then they left. I closed the front door behind them. I stood in the hallway for a moment. My heart was beating harder than I would have liked, but it was beating. I called Karen that night, my daughter. I told her, in broad terms, what was happening. Not everything, not the legal specifics, but enough. She was quiet for a moment after I finished, and then she said, Mom, why didn't you tell me sooner? I needed to know what I was dealing with first, I said. I'm coming up next weekend, she said. No discussion. All right, I said. I slept better that night than I had since September the 4th. Not well, but better. After that, I took 3 days for myself. I did not call Patricia, though I knew she was working. I did not answer when Deborah called, twice. I gardened, I cooked, I read. I sat on the back porch in the October air and let the silence of the yard settle around me. I needed those days, not for weakness, for the kind of rest that replenishes the part of you that has to stay sharp. On the 4th morning after the confrontation in my living room, Ron came downstairs before I was out of the kitchen and set a single sheet of paper on the table beside my coffee cup. Read it, he said. Think about it. That's all I'm asking. Then he went out to his truck and drove away. It was a 1-page letter, handwritten, in Ron's careful accountant-trained print. 41 years I had read that handwriting on shopping lists and birthday cards, and once, long ago, on a love letter he had sent me when we were young, and he was away at a conference in Atlanta and had apparently felt something strongly enough to put it on paper. The letter said, in essence, that he was sorry for the manner in which things had begun, meaning the text message, the manila folder, and that he had not handled it well. He acknowledged that. He said that his feelings had not changed regarding the divorce, but that he wanted to make sure I was taken care of. He described what he was now calling a generous settlement. The house, free and clear, monthly support for 5 years, and a lump sum he described as substantial. The number he offered was $60,000. I read it twice. Then I folded it and placed it in my cardigan pocket, next to where I kept my notepad. $60,000 when there was nearly $3 million on the table, and an offer of the house, a house he was also threatening to move back into, and 5 years of support, which left a 68-year-old woman to manage at 73 on whatever she had managed to save. I understood what the letter was. It was not remorse. It was a test. He wanted to see if sentiment, the handwriting, the soft words, the callback to our years together, could do what threats had not. He wanted to see if I was the woman he apparently believed I was. Someone who could be moved by the gesture of being offered less than she deserved in a gentle voice. I thought about my answer for approximately 30 seconds. It was no, but I did not call him or text him or leave a note. I let the offer sit, unanswered, which I knew from 41 years of marriage would be more unsettling to Ron than any explicit refusal. He needed to know where he stood. Uncertainty was a far more uncomfortable place for him than conflict. Deborah drove past the house twice that week. Slowly. I noticed from the garden. She didn't stop. Karen arrived on Saturday morning with 2 large bags and a pot of chicken soup she had made at home and packed in a cooler. Because Karen is the kind of daughter who brings soup when she travels 4 hours to support her mother. She looked around the house when she came in, taking it in, I think, with fresh eyes. And then she hugged me for a long time without saying anything. We sat at the kitchen table and I told her everything, all of it. Pauline's bequest, Patricia Gale, the confrontation with Ron and Deborah, the letter, the $60,000. When I finished, Karen sat quietly for a moment. "Mom," she said, "you should have told me sooner." "I know," I said. "Are you scared?" "Yes," I said, "but it doesn't seem to be stopping me." She reached across the table and held my hand. "Good," she said. Karen stayed for 4 days. She slept in the guest room and cooked breakfast, and in the evenings we sat on the back porch and talked. Sometimes about the divorce, sometimes about the garden, sometimes about nothing in particular. The way you can with someone who has known you their whole life. It was the most sustained human company I'd had in months, and I hadn't realized until then how much I had been running on empty. On Sunday, she drove me to the Methodist church I had attended for 20 years. I had avoided it in the weeks since September, not wanting to answer questions, not wanting to perform normalcy for an audience. But that Sunday, I sat in my usual pew and let the familiar rhythms of the service move around me. And afterward, several women I had known for decades, Harriet Osgood, June Weatherby, Connie Frakes, came and sat with me in the fellowship hall, and one by one, without my having to say very much, the community shaped itself around what I was going through. Harriet Osgood, who had been widowed twice, pressed my hand and said, "Martha, you are tougher than you know." "I'm learning that," I said. I also called David, my son, in Portland. He was in the middle of his own difficult stretch. His divorce had been finalized the previous spring, and he was still finding his footing. But he listened carefully, asked good questions, and said he was proud of me. That word, proud, surprised me. Parents are usually the ones saying that to their children. Having it reversed was disorienting in the best possible way. I did not call Ron. I did not respond to the letter. I let Deborah's 2 slow drive-bys go unremarked. I existed quietly and purposefully, and I waited for Patricia's next report. It came on a Thursday afternoon. The financial disclosure request had come back. Ron's attorney, a man named Howard Sills from a practice in the next county, had submitted the documents Patricia had requested. He opened a new savings account the same week Pauline died, Patricia told me. He deposited $170,000 from the estate into it before any commingling question could attach. That was strategic. He was protecting that portion. But not all of it, I said. No. The majority of the estate went into the joint brokerage account you and Ron share. He deposited it there, possibly by mistake, possibly because that was where liquid assets were typically managed in your household. Either way, once it's in the joint account, commingling is established. That portion is now arguable as marital property. I did not say anything for a moment. I was doing the arithmetic, approximately $2.8 million total, 170,000 protected, the rest, over $2.5 million, potentially in play. How much could I legitimately argue for? I asked. In Virginia, equitable distribution doesn't mean 50-50. It means fair, based on contributions to the marriage, length of marriage, and other factors. With 41 years and your role in the household, we have a strong argument. She paused. Martha, this is a good case. I thanked her and set down the phone. Outside the kitchen window, the last roses of October were still holding on. I looked at them for a while. Then I went back to my notepad and wrote, very carefully, the next set of steps. They came on a Tuesday evening, 2 weeks after Karen had gone home. I heard a car in the driveway and looked out to see both Ron's truck and Deborah's silver sedan. They had coordinated the arrival. That small detail told me everything I needed to know about what this visit was going to be. I had time to decide how I wanted to receive them. I could have not opened the door. I had spoken with Patricia about this possibility, and she had told me I was under no legal obligation to engage with Ron in any capacity outside of formal proceedings, given the nature of the conflict. But I opened the door. I wanted to hear them. They stood on my front porch. My front porch, the one with the green rocking chairs I had bought in 2004. And they were both dressed as though for an occasion. Ron in his button-down, Deborah in a blazer. They were performing something. We just want to talk, Deborah said. She was smiling. It was the particular smile of someone who has rehearsed warmth. No lawyers, no arguments, just family. Family. I had always found it interesting how quickly that word was deployed when someone wanted something from you. I stepped back and let them into the living room. I did not offer them anything to drink, which in 41 years of hosting in that house I had never failed to do. The omission was deliberate, and, from the way Ron's eyes moved to the kitchen and back, he noticed. We sat. They had clearly decided Deborah would lead. She began with conciliation. She said that she and Ron had been talking and that they felt the whole situation had gotten out of hand. She said that no one wanted this to become a legal battle. Not for my sake, not for Ron's, not for the sake of the family's reputation in Clover Creek. She said that she personally had a great deal of respect for everything I had contributed to Ron's life. I listened. I kept my face neutral. 22 years of library work had given me a talent for listening to people without revealing what I thought about what they were saying. Then she shifted. The smile stayed, but something underneath it changed. She said that she had spoken with Howard Sills, Ron's attorney, which was information I was not supposed to have been given and which she dropped with the casual ease of someone testing to see if I flinched, and that the contested proceedings were going to be complicated and costly. She said that the financial disclosure process had already shown that Ron's assets were largely, clearly separate property, and that a judge was unlikely to rule otherwise. She said that my portion of any settlement was probably far less than what I might hope for. Then she paused and leaned forward slightly and said, "Martha, you're 68 years old. Do you really want to spend the next 2 or 3 years in and out of courtrooms? That takes a toll. On your health, on your peace of mind, on your relationships." She glanced toward the window as if she were imagining Harriet Osgood and June Weatherby and all the church ladies, and what they might think. People talk, even well-meaning people. There it was. The real thing under the conciliation. The threat, dressed up as concern. I looked at her. I looked at Ron, who had said very little, who was sitting in the armchair across from me, the armchair where I had sat on the morning of September the 4th, with his hands clasped and his eyes on the carpet. "Ron," I said quietly. He looked up. "Did you know that Pauline left me that account?" A very long silence. In 41 years of marriage, that silence told me everything. "She mentioned you in the documents," he said finally. "I thought it was a formality. Did you hire Howard Sills before or after Pauline passed away?" Another silence. "Ron," Deborah said sharply. "Before," he said, quietly, just that one word. I nodded. "Thank you for telling me that." Deborah recovered quickly. She told me that even if I had some claim to certain assets, the process of pursuing it would cost far more in legal fees than I would likely recover. She said this with the confidence of someone who believes they are the smartest person in the room and that the person across from them can be convinced of the same. "I want you both to leave," I said. "Martha, we're trying to help you." "You are trying," I said, "to help yourselves. There's a difference, and I know the difference. I'd like you to leave now, please." Deborah stood. There was no more pretense of warmth. Her face was the face it had always been under the pleasantness. Sharp-boned, assessing, annoyed. "You're making a serious mistake," she said. "You're the second time you've said that to me," I said. "I'll take my chances." Ron stood without looking at me. He walked to the front door. Deborah followed him, and just before she stepped out onto the porch, she turned back. "You should think very carefully about what you're throwing away," she said. I looked at her steadily. "I should think about what I was willing to accept for 41 years, I said. "That's what I've been thinking about." She left. I locked the front door behind them. I stood in the hallway with my hand still on the deadbolt, and the fear moved through me then, real and cold. Not the sprawling fear of September, but a focused one. They are not going to stop. I understood that clearly, but underneath the fear, something had solidified. The conversation in that living room had given me something no legal document could have. Ron's own admission, witnessed only by me, but real and irreversible, that he had hired his attorney before Pauline died, that he had seen the inheritance coming and had begun the process of cutting me out in advance. He had told me the truth, possibly the only entirely honest thing he had said to me in months, and he had done it because Deborah had pushed him into the room and the question had caught him unprepared. That moment was mine. I held it carefully, like something fragile and valuable, and I carried it with me back to the kitchen where I called Patricia and told her exactly what he had said. The deposition was scheduled for a Thursday morning in early December, in a conference room on the second floor of a building in the next county, neutral territory, arranged by the court. Patricia had requested it weeks earlier, citing new information regarding the timeline of Ron's legal preparations and the circumstances of the financial disclosures. Howard Sills had attempted twice to have it postponed. Both attempts were denied. I had been in that building once before, years ago, for a property dispute involving a neighbor's fence line. I remembered that the hallway smelled like industrial cleaning solution and that the elevator was slow. Both things were still true on the morning I arrived with Patricia at my side, carrying a slim leather portfolio and wearing the same navy blazer I had worn to her office 3 months earlier. Ron and Howard Sills were already in the conference room when we arrived. Deborah was not. She had no legal standing to be present. This had clearly been a source of frustration. I knew because Patricia had mentioned that Sills had attempted to have her included as a family representative. The request had been denied. Ron looked tired. He was in a suit, I recognized, the charcoal one he wore to serious occasions, and he had dark circles under his eyes that I had not seen even in the worst weeks after his mother's death. Howard Sills was a compact man in his late 50s, with a practiced courtroom manner that I imagine worked very well in front of juries. In a conference room, across a table, with Patricia Gale sitting across from him, it read differently. We were under oath. The court reporter set up her equipment at the end of the table. Patricia opened her portfolio. What followed was 2.5 hours. I want to describe it accurately because it was not dramatic in the way of films or television. It was slow and precise and relentlessly methodical, and I think that slowness was its own form of power. Patricia began with the timeline. She asked Ron, carefully and in sequence, to describe every action he had taken between the date of Pauline's death and the date he sent me the text message. This had been submitted in the disclosures, but disclosures on paper can be shaped. Verbal deposition, under oath, with follow-up questions, is different. Ron answered. His answers were careful at first, guided by the posture Sills had presumably coached him into. Steady, factual, clipped. Yes, he had retained Howard Sills on a specific date. Howard Sills interjected to clarify the date was after Pauline's passing. Patricia produced a document. She set it on the table and slid it to Ron. Mr. Collins, can you look at this document and tell me what it is? It was a billing record from Sills's own office, dated 16 days before Pauline's death. The silence in that room was extraordinary. Mr. Sills, Patricia said pleasantly, your office billing record appears to predate your client's stated version of when he sought legal counsel. Could you help us understand that discrepancy? What followed was a brief, chaotic passage during which Sills attempted to characterize the billing record as a consultation rather than a formal engagement. And Ron, perhaps because he had already told me the truth in his living room and the habit had not worn off, or perhaps because he was genuinely exhausted, said something that contradicted Sills's characterization precisely enough that Sills visibly shifted in his chair. Then Patricia turned to the financial disclosures. She walked Ron through every deposit, every transfer. She asked him specifically about the joint brokerage account. She asked him whether, at the time he deposited estate funds into that account, he was aware that commingling those funds with marital assets could constitute partial marital property. Ron said he had not thought about it in those terms. Patricia then produced a document from Pauline's estate attorney, obtained through formal discovery, which showed that Pauline's estate attorney had sent Ron a written communication explicitly noting that funds deposited into marital accounts might be subject to equitable distribution claims. The letter was dated 10 days before Ron made the deposit. He had been told. He had deposited the money anyway, either through carelessness or because he had not imagined I would contest anything. Mr. Collins, Patricia said, in the same steady voice she had used throughout, did you receive this letter? A very long pause. Ron looked at Sills. Sills looked at the table. Yes, Ron said. There was one more piece. Patricia had, through the discovery process, obtained a copy of the text messages between Ron and Deborah in the 2 weeks following Pauline's death. There were 47 of them. Patricia read several into the record. In one, Ron wrote to Deborah, "Need to move before she figures it out. What does Sills say about timing?" In another, Deborah responded, "Just make sure the separate account is clean before you tell her anything. She won't know to look." Ron stared at the table when those were read aloud. Sills requested a brief recess. Patricia granted it pleasantly. I sat in the hallway on a plastic chair while the attorneys conferred with their respective clients. Patricia came out after 8 minutes and sat beside me. "He's going to want to talk settlement," she said quietly. "I know," I said. "Martha, based on everything on the table, the commingling, the timeline, the communications, we are in a very strong position." "What would a fair settlement look like?" I asked. She told me a number. It was not $60,000. I looked down the hallway toward the slow elevator and the institutional smell and the winter light coming through the window at the far end. I thought of the house on Birchwood Lane, where the roses would come back in June, whether I was there or not. I thought of Ron's handwriting on a love letter from 1983. I thought of 41 years of fluency in a language I had now decided to stop speaking. "Tell him yes," I said, "but not a dollar less." The settlement was finalized on the 18th of January, 7 days after a second and significantly shorter meeting with both attorneys, in which Howard Sills presented revised terms and Patricia countered with ours. What followed was less a negotiation than a slow, methodical capitulation on Ron's side. The house on Birchwood Lane was transferred to me fully and without encumbrance. My name, sole. No buyout provision, no shared equity claim. Mine, the roses included. A financial settlement of $850,000, drawn from the estate funds deposited into the joint brokerage account and established as partially marital property under Virginia's equitable distribution standard. Patricia had argued well, and the 41 years had argued for themselves. Ongoing spousal support for 7 years. And separately, outside the divorce settlement entirely, Pauline's $240,000 had been transferred into my personal account in November. Quiet and clean, like something she had packed carefully for a journey she had known I would need to take. Ron retained the separately held savings account, the $170,000 he had moved early, plus whatever remained after legal fees, which had been substantial. Howard Sills did not come cheap, and a contested deposition with documentary evidence of premeditated financial maneuvering had been an expensive problem to navigate. The rental property he had apparently intended to share with Deborah fell through when the landlord withdrew the listing. On the morning the final papers were signed, I sat in Patricia's office and watched her pass the last document across the desk. "You did well," she said. "We did well," I said. Outside, it was January cold. I sat in my car for a few minutes before driving anywhere. There was relief, a physical sense of long-held tension releasing from my shoulders, as if I had been carrying something on a long walk and had finally set it down. There was also grief. 41 years is a long time to build something, even something that turned out to be less solid than you believed. But underneath both, steady and unhurried, was something else. The particular confidence that comes not from winning, but from discovering you were capable of winning. That the person you had been for 68 years, careful, present, underestimated, had resources you had not known to inventory. Deborah called once in February. She said nothing when I answered. I said, "I hope you're well, Deborah," and ended the call. I felt no triumph, only a mild sadness that it had ever had to be any of this. I went back to cutting the rose canes. They need cutting back hard in January. It looks brutal from a distance, but it is what allows them to come back strong in June. By the following June, the roses on Birchwood Lane were the best they had been in years. I spent the winter doing exactly what I wanted, at the pace I chose. I repainted the kitchen a soft sage green that I had always wanted and Ron had always dismissed. I reorganized the library shelves. I bought a new chair for the back porch and sat in it most mornings while the birds came to the feeders I had finally refilled properly. Karen came in March with her family. My grandchildren helped me plant sweet peas along the fence, which grew extravagantly by May. David flew out in April. He looked better than he had in years. We went fishing in the creek at the edge of town, didn't catch anything worth keeping, and it was one of the best days I'd had in a long time. I donated a portion of Pauline's bequest to the Clover Creek Public Library, where I had worked for 22 years, to fund an expanded legal reference section. The director's letter of thanks I framed and hung in my study, which I had repainted sage green and reclaimed entirely as my own. As for Ron and Deborah, the legal fees, the settlement, and the ongoing support payments had taken a significant portion of Ron's imagined future apart. He lived quietly and, by all available accounts, without much pleasure. A man who had organized his late years around a particular picture and found himself in a considerably smaller version of it. Deborah returned to Roanoke and resumed the life she had left, which was less than what she had counted on. I bore her no particular malice. She had done what she did. The consequences were what they were. What I had not expected was how much lighter the house felt. Not empty, lighter. Like a room when you open the windows after a long winter and realize the air had been close and stale for a very long time. On a Saturday morning in late June, I cut the first roses of the season. Deep, full pink, the variety I had planted 36 years ago because I had always loved them, and Ron had always found them fussy. I put them in a blue ceramic vase on the kitchen table and sat down with my coffee in my sage green kitchen in my house on my street. No music, no revelation. Just a 68-year-old woman at her own table with flowers she had grown herself in a color she had always chosen. It was more than enough. What I learned is this: the resources were always there, the spine, the patience, the capacity to think clearly under pressure. 41 years of being underestimated had not diminished those things. It had quietly stored them. You don't have to be loud to protect yourself. You have to be present. And when the moment comes, you have to stop performing smallness. So tell me, if you had been standing at that kitchen sink reading that message, what would you have done? Leave it in the comments. Thank you for listening.